Okay, I subjected myself to the Game Changers movie not once but twice for you guys so I could review it. I watched it 2 nights ago. I rented it I guess I got a 48-hour run at the thing. I spent $3 or $4 to do this. So anyway, that's my sacrifice for you guys. So the first time through, I just watched it, took it in, look at all the sort of the emotional appeal, and then I went through and watched it slowly and analyzed all the different particular parts of the film. So I'm going to go over that with you guys now. So the Game Changers film, I think most of the filming took place maybe 2017, it would seem. I know it was delayed quite a bit because they had a lot of problem with the different athletes, some of them dropping out of the film. It's produced primarily by James Cameron. Arnold Schwarzenegger's in there, Jackie Chan, Lewis Hamilton, Chris Paul, Novak Djokovic, and some others have executively produced that movie, which means they paid money for it, right? They donated money to get their name listed as a producer. But Cameron in particular has a significant conflict of interest as he owns $140 million worth of investment in Verdiant, which is the largest pea protein processing plant in the world. Just to put that out there from the very beginning. And so this is obviously a vegan propaganda film. And like all vegan propaganda films, it largely plays upon emotion. They use a lot of cherry-picked data and so on and so forth. And we'll go over that. So the protagonist of this story is a guy named James Wilkes, who is a former UFC guy who is pretending like he's just taking up veganism now as he's learning about it over a period of months as the movie unfolds, when in reality he's been vegan for much longer. So I'm not sure why that particular sort of ruse was utilized to pretend he's discovering this stuff for the first time, obviously for dramatic effect. So anyway, he's retired from the UFC, now works training people in self-defense skills. And so that's the beginning of the movie. We then take a detour into the gladiators, where they talk about looking through some old gladiator bones and seeing that they mostly ate a vegetarian diet, which is not surprising since the gladiators were basically slaves, and slaves were fed basically less quality food. And it's not that they were super strong or athletic because of that food. It's they ate that food, and it was given to them because, like I said, they were slaves. Many people felt that the grains that they ate might have allowed them to put on excess body fat, so that when they were in combat, a superficial incision would not penetrate too deeply, and so there would be more blood, but with less damage to the athletes. And so the point of gladiators eating a lot of grain and barley and vegetables is really just the fact that they're slaves. We then go to the build-up between the Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz fight, and the premise behind this is Nate Diaz is a vegan and Conor McGregor is a big meat eater. And when in fact Nate Diaz is not a vegan, he's been eating meat all along, fish particularly, and things like that. So I don't think he is actually a vegan, although many vegans will claim him to be so. That doesn't seem to be the case. And the premise of the movie really is that if you eat meat, your arteries are going to clog up, you're going to be sick, you're going to perform less well, you're just clearly not a very good athlete. When they clearly show that Conor McGregor is eating just tons of meat, right, all the time, that's his diet, he's eating 2 steaks here and there, and Conor McGregor is still one of the greatest athletes in the UFC. And so if we're saying that meat somehow destroys your athletic ability, I mean, Conor McGregor, you shouldn't have put him up and said he ate a lot of meat, because he clearly, was the 2-time or 2 weight classes at the same time champion. And so you can't at one time say meat is bad for you and then show a guy who's a world-class athlete eating meat. It just doesn't make sense. We then go into the build-up of Scott Jurek, who is a longtime vegan ultra runner who's had success running the Western States run for several years, attempting to do the Appalachian Trail to set the record on that, which is somewhere around 46 days. So they start off with the film with him starting to do this, and to not to delay the suspense. He basically completes that task, and this was done, I think, in 2015. So a lot of this, they go way back in time to find some vegans that they could utilize. Now, the interesting thing about Scott Jurek is he's probably, among ultra runners that have tried the Appalachian Trail, I don't know if there's been that many that have tried it even, so it's not surprising he was able to break the record. However, when you look at the record today, he broke the record by about 3 or 4 hours. Scott Jurek did. The record today is held by someone named Karel Saab, who comes from Belgium. He is a dentist. He broke the record by 5 days, so he's basically shattered the record that Scott Jurek had. And interestingly, when you look up the website on Karel Saab, when he talks about conquering the Appalachian Trail, he's eating eggs and bacon for breakfast. And so, here's a point that, there's a guy that's eating a bunch of animal products that far exceeded Scott Jurek's performance. So if you want to use that as a comparison. We then go on to see Dr. James Loomis, who is a doctor, apparently goes in a lot of these plant-based films, and all these plant-based network guys. He was apparently seen in Forks Over Knives. At one point, I didn't see Forks Over Knives. Anyway, he talks about the Liebig theory for meat for athletes. This goes back to the 1800s, where they were observing that most of the people that didn't eat meat didn't do well, and meat was considered superior. They go on to then go through a list of some mostly vegetarians, and this is the thing. My video yesterday, we talked about Tom Brady and that people say he's plant-based, but really Tom is eating more protein and more fish, more eggs, more red meat than the average American, and so yet they still lump them into plant-based. So there's this sort of weird, bizarre way to say people are plant-based when they're really eating perhaps lots of eggs, lots of dairy, and yet being claimed as plant-based. So it doesn't quite make sense. So they talk about Murray Rose, who won 4 Olympic gold medals back in the 1950s, being a vegetarian, but it's known that he ate eggs, copious eggs, cheese, and goat's milk. So again, does that support plant-based or not? And interestingly, Murray Rose, despite being vegetarian, died of cancer at age 73. Edwin Moses was represented. Again, he's a vegetarian, not vegan, so it's hard to say how much animal protein he was actually ingesting. They talk about Carl Lewis, who went vegan at the very end of his career. And this is a common theme. We see athletes that go vegan, and typically what happens is maybe they give up dairy, but more importantly, they give up a lot of processed and junk food. They see a short-term improvement, followed by a decline that seems to happen somewhere between 6 months and maybe 2 years, where we see this happen. So Carl Lewis, like most of the vegans in this film, had a very brief period of time where his performance was maybe slightly better, and then he had a decline, and basically he retired after that. Dotsie Bouch is a track cyclist that's next shown to show her in her build-up to the Olympic silver medal performance that she had as part of the Team Pursuit Olympic team. This was done in 2012. Again, they go way back to find somebody that they can utilize now. What they failed to say is Dotsie Bouch. Now, interesting about her, she recovered from anorexia and drug addiction as a younger person with, obviously an eating disorder and drug addiction as a model. She then sort of rescued herself with that by diet, not a vegan diet, by the way. Built up all of her strength. Was an 8-time U.S. national track cycling champion. Somewhere in the last few years of that, she switched over to veganism. So again, this is another common theme. These athletes build up all their performance as an omnivore, as a meat eater, and then they switch over to veganism for a brief period of time, still continue to do okay, and then they finish. And the same thing happened to her. She was vegan for the last few years of her career, and then retired. And she did win a silver medal in the Olympics, which is a great job. Track cycling has been going on since about 1984, so not a really long history of the sport. But again, omnivore, build up her strength, build up all of her athletic performance, maintain it as a vegan. Then we see Dr. James Loomis comes in there, and he gives us this sort of comparison of animal versus plant protein. He makes the claim that all protein is formed by plants, which first of all is inaccurate. And then he goes on to say that you can get just as much protein from plant sources, and he fails to recognize that the ratios of the amino acids are very different. Now, while plants may contain most or all of the essential amino acids, they come in very different ratios than what we utilize them, and therefore you have to eat and go out of your way to eat much more of a plant food to obtain the same nutrients as, say, things like lysine or leucine. which you would get from animal protein, which are essential amino acids. And so it's very misleading in that fact, you obviously have to eat way more volume of food to get the adequate same amount of protein that you would from animal-based products. In addition to protein, there are many other products in animal-based foods, including carnitine, creatine, taurine, B vitamins, zinc, iron, so on and so forth, which are helpful that may not be found as readily in plant food, and some of them not at all. But back to the protein, plants actually get their protein from protein that has been formed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. And so if we wanted to really take that argument down, where they claim animals are the middlemen, then we would be eating dirt, soil, and bacteria to get our protein if we want to take it down to the lowest common denominator. So it's kind of disingenuous to suggest that plants are the source of all protein when it's actually not true. Nitrogen is in the atmosphere, fixed by bacteria, taken up by the rhizome or the root system of the plant, where it's then eaten by animals and then eaten by us. So we then go on to the next athlete, Kendrick Farris. And so Kendrick Farris, they make a big deal of the fact that he was in the 2016 Olympics as the only male as a vegan. Now, Kendrick Farris went vegan sometime in 2014. We see that he was in the Olympics in 2008, 2012, 2013, early 2014, all as a meat-eating omnivore. He was very well accomplished, an excellent lifter. Again, another guy that built up all his muscle strength as a omnivore meat-eater, goes vegan, has a slight period where he makes a slight PR of 2 kilos, which was an American record, which he already had. Then as he goes longer into veganism, he gets to the 2016 Olympics, and he totals 257 kilograms, which is, 357 kilograms, which is by no means a bad effort, but, 262 kilograms. His 255 kilograms, my bad. So this is in 2016. In 2008, he had totaled 7 kilos more as a meat eater. So he had actually totaled much more as a meat eater. And he was at a lighter weight class too as a meat eater. He was about 20 pounds less. He was in the 85 kilogram class in 2008. 2016, he's in the 94 kilogram class. He actually does worse. His performance goes down significantly. You would expect if you were in a heavier weight class, you would, lift much more weight, but the opposite occurred for him. He then becomes injured. I think he hurt his elbow, has not really competed since then, and interestingly, he's recently been seen in Louisiana at a steak dinner charity event as a speaker. And so we see that veganism did not serve him particularly well for longevity in his career. The film then goes on to talk about Morgan Mitchell, which I missed earlier. She was a sprinter. She was one of the top sprinters in Australia, in fact, made the Australian Olympic team. She was a 400-meter runner, best in the country. She switched over to veganism about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and since that time has lost speed in the 400 meters to now where she's able to be beaten by U.S. high school students. Her time has gone down significantly, so much so that she completely switched events to the 800-meter event, which requires less strength to power and strength to weight ratio. So she's gotten weaker and slower in the 400 and no longer runs it anymore. And so this is, her deal. And during the film, she talks about how the 400 requires, just strength and then power endurance. And apparently she can't do that anymore after going vegan. We then see Patrick Baboumian talking about, this is the strong man, I'll talk a bit more about him, talking about how he's strong as an ox. I mean, apparently he thinks he has a rumen, perhaps, I'm not sure. But again, another person builds up all his muscle as an omnivore, as a meat eater, and also using steroids. And then goes vegan. We'll see what happens there. Brian Jennings, the boxer, comes in talking about his switch to vegan, which he did in about 2015. 2015, he fought Klitschko for the title, which he lost. He has not had another title shot since. In his most recent bout against James Joyce, he also lost. And so Again, another example of athlete builds up strength, power, endurance, athletic prowess as a meteor, goes vegan, and sees, basically a decline in performance over time. Dr. Robert Vogel comes in and talks about the endothelium and talking about how a high-fat meal of animal-based products will somehow interfere with the endothelium. And he does an experiment to sort of exemplify this. And so he recruits 3 guys from the Miami Dolphins. One is Michael Thomas, one is Griff Whalen, and one is Kenny Stills. And so he basically feeds the guys burritos, one with meat, one with beans. And Griff Whalen, because he's a vegan, eats beans both times. And he goes out and shows their blood vial, and the ones where they had meat in 2 hours before the blood was taken show some cloudiness, which represents more fat in the blood. Now, that is not surprising at all. We know that eating a fat-rich meal will cause a temporary rise in fatty acids in the blood. That's normal. There's a reason for that. The blood is going, it's being absorbed in the digestive system through the portal system into the liver, and the liver pushes out fat to the cells that need it. It's basically feeding the cells. And this is what we're seeing, that in the postprandial period, those cells, the muscle cells, the organ cells, the rest of the cells in the body are taking up that fat for energy, and this is a normal phenomenon. What we're seeing is people making the claim that having fat in the blood is now damaging the endothelium. That is, basically may or not be true. However, we know that people eating, say perhaps a carnivore diet or meat-based diet, they eat less frequently, and so the blood triglyceride or blood fats are up transiently, and then they go back down quickly. Now, whereas we see people that may not eat that way, that eat frequently, maybe on a high-carb diet, the blood fat goes up a bit and stays there. And we see that when we look at fasting triglyceride levels, perhaps in people that eat low-carb diets, carnivorous diets, they're extremely, extremely low. So the long-term cumulative effect is possibly worse, from a triglyceride level if you're eating perhaps a high-carb diet. Now, they don't say that in the film, but what we see is that, these triglycerides are very transient, and to conflate that with, that's what's going on all the time. If you're not eating every 2 hours, and particularly eating high fat every 2 hours, which you shouldn't be, this is likely not an issue. Now interestingly, those 3 athletes that were involved, Michael Thomas, Griff Whalen, and Kenny Stills, we look at what happened to those athletes over time since this movie's been shot. Well, Griff Whalen, the vegan, was, traded, injured, ended up in the CFL and put on the practice team, and about basically no longer is playing. So the vegan's no longer playing. Michael Thomas, the guy who had fat in the blood, next year went to the Pro Bowl and still actively playing. And the same thing with Kenny Stills, although he's now playing for the Houston Texans. So of those 3 athletes, the only one that's not playing anymore is Griff Whalen, the vegan. All right, so, in conjunction with this, they referenced several studies. One of the studies was paid for by the Haas Avocado Board, looking at how avocados placed on a hamburger make less of this phenomenon. And again, we want to look at conflicts of interest there. They show a 2,000 study showing impaired blood flow, mediated vasoactive activity, and the fat they used was heavy whipping cream and liquid chocolate with non-fat dry milk. And so, that's your fat source. They show another study, 2000, postprandial hypertriglyceridemia impairs endothelial function, enhances oxygen stress. There's no idea what they were feeding these people. That's not listed in the study. They didn't then make the claim that a study on beet juice gives you a 19% increase in your bench press strength. And so, when you look at that and you say 19%, that's more than what steroids give people. And so this, you have to dismiss that study on the ridiculousness of this. To think you can eat some beet juice and all of a sudden be 19-20% stronger is just absolutely ludicrous. And so this is just a silly little sort of reference they throw in the book or in the movie. We then get Dr. Scott Stoll, who's another plant-based doctor, talking about the evils of meat and the compounds, TMAO, new 5GC, heme iron. He once again cites this Haas avocado study. He talks about antioxidants in plants being more than meat. Well, we know that the antioxidants in plants don't really work that well in the human system. And we do know that we have an endogenous antioxidant system, which is very robust. And that's what we actually use and utilize in our system. Things like glutathione, superoxide dismutase, cystathione, uric acid. These things are endogenously derived antioxidants. So this antioxidant sort of scam is not really all that helpful. But he talks about the scary compounds in meat and the great compounds in plant, but he completely omits the fact that these healthy compounds in meat, such as carnosine, carnitine, choline, so on and so forth. We then see the Tennessee Titans for the first time. They talk a little bit about Derek Morgan. I'll talk more about those guys. They then cut to James Wilkstad having a mild heart attack, which is very concerning. We then get to see Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. Kim Williams, Dr. Columbus Batiste, Dr. Helen Moon, talking about the evils of meat and talking about inflammatory compounds in lean meat and dairy from Dr. Columbus Batiste. We see Dr. Moon quoting some study on heme iron and showing an increased risk of coronary heart disease. Again, this is a epidemiology, population health study with food frequency surveys, high confounders. What they show is that study did not show any relationship between heme iron consumption in the Asian population. Again, it's all down to what else is going on in these populations. So this is the thing these vegans like to do. They like to throw out all these epidemiologic studies, which are basically, for the most part, largely nonsense. Then we get, I believe, Dean Ornish talking about a study that was done by Valter Longo showing that people in middle age ate higher amounts of protein, had higher risk for cancer and heart disease. Now, when you look, there was another study that we looked at prior to that. It was about dietary protein and the risk of ischemic heart disease in middle-aged men. It wasn't the Valter Longo study, but one of the doctors put this out there. And when you look at the conclusion of that study, it says there is no risk for protein for this population. There's a caveat there that says it may be in the subclass of healthy men, there's a slight relative risk increase. But the conclusion of that study, which they quote, says no risk. So it's kind of just bizarre that they would use that study. Then we go into the Ornish study. And so this is something that I think is very sort of telling. And so the study is entitled, Can Lifestyle Change Reverse Coronary Heart Disease? The Lifestyle Heart Trial. First of all, that study was not vegan. This study included lean dairy, lean meat like fish, chicken, so on and so forth. Not a vegan study. It's a comprehensive lifestyle change, including decreasing smoking, drinking, more exercise, meditation, all these support factors. And what we see is a tiny change that may have been so small that it may be within the measurement error. What we see is they look at stenosis of the coronary arteries, and the average stenosis level was 40%. That was moved down to 37.8%, so 2.2% difference in change. That's really nothing. I mean, it's so small that it may not indicate really anything, and it's like if you were going from 40 to 0, that would be interesting. But this study that's been held up by vegans is basically really a kind of a joke of a study. It doesn't really show a profound effect. Rip Esselstyn is now, the son of Caldwell Esselstyn, is now shown scaring firemen about heart disease, and he shows a big patent artery, cross-section of an artery, and then he shows a clogged artery, and he says, well, that's a meat-eater artery, and he's gonna scare these firemen into changing their diet. We then get a little bit of time with Lucius Smith, He's a 60-year-old NFL guy that James Wilkes goes to see. Lucius is in very good shape. He's in there working out at 60, lean, muscular guy. Says, he's a former NFL athlete, says he's been on a plant-based diet for 10 years. We don't know what that plant-based diet is. He doesn't say that he's vegan. Very well could be that he's a vegetarian, that he eats eggs and fish and, or dairy or something like that, kind of like Tom Brady. So we don't really know, what his diet actually is. We then go on to see Arnold Schwarzenegger, who tries to sell us on the fact that he didn't need meat to build his body, and he was misled, citing now that his cholesterol is lower than it's been in his entire life at age 69. His total cholesterol, I assume, is 109. I assume he's talking about total cholesterol. The hypocrisy of Arnold Schwarzenegger saying this is, I don't think it needs much explanation. Okay, then we get to the Valter Longo study, and Dean Ornish is quoting this. And this study, again, showed a 400% increase in cancer rates and a significant increase in cardiovascular disease in men that ate a high-protein diet in midlife. Now, that study was based on NHANES data that was clearly cherry-picked. And if you want to listen to a significant criticism of this, listen to what Professor Don Layman had to say about it. He said this is one of the worst studies he's ever seen in his life. He cannot believe it was published. He and about 12 other PhDs wrote a criticism of that study to the journal, I think it was Cell, who Valter Longo actually sits on the editorial board, and they rejected to publish their criticism of that study. This study is an absolute joke. The funniest thing is that it has you believe, and the relative risks are outrageous. They're saying something like your risk of dying of diabetes as a meteor is 70 times as much, 75 times as much, 75,000 times, or 7,500 times as much as if you were a non-meat eater, which is absolutely ridiculous. Nothing else in the literature would support that. That is completely inconsistent with all other evidence. And what happens is magically after the age of 65, now all that protein damage doesn't hurt you anymore. So it's basically, how do you believe this? One thing that's so awful for you at midlife is now great for you later in life. It's just a ridiculous study. Again, listen to our Human Performance Outliers podcast with Professor Don Layman, who he goes into lengthy criticism of that. He also has written a lengthy letter, which maybe I'll post as well. We then go to see Walter Willett. Walter Willett has to make an appearance, and as you guys may or not know, Walter Willett is the guy from Harvard who has been pumping out epidemiology studies like it has been going out of style with his mission of, promoting his vegetarian vegan diet. And again, he quotes a epidemiology food frequency study showing that not red meat, but actually chicken raises your risk for cancer. Where red meat doesn't seem to have an effect in that case. And so this is all this, basically weak epidemiology that they love to quote. The study that he used again was basically a study called Dietary Risk Factors for Colon Cancer in a Low-Risk Population. White meat was worse than red meat. This was done through the Adventist Health System. So as we know, the Adventist Health System is a religious organization whose one of its core beliefs is in vegetarianism. And so this is such biased sort of stuff. We then go on to a handful of anthropologists that are going to now tell us that humans are actually herbivores or meant to eat mostly a vegetarian diet. They cite guys like Richard Wrangham, Christina Warner, and Nathaniel Dominy. Dominy in particular thinks humans are starchivores, that we basically live on starch. Dr. McDougall would be proud. Christina Warner spends her career debunking the paleo diet and speaks to places like the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which is a PETA front group, and Richard Wrangham is a vegan primatologist from Harvard. Now, these guys go on to say that tool use, probably not important. All the thousands of tools we've shown, it's only probably a small part of the diet. They mostly just ate plants, and now they've discovered a few plant fossils that show that there were some plants around there. They go on Christina Warner goes on to say that there's no biologic, genetic, or physiologic or anatomic adaptations that humans have as meat eaters, which is the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard. I mean, we have a gastric pH of 1.5, lowest in the animal kingdom, for the specific purpose of eating meat. I mean, we have a throwing arm. It wasn't to throw rocks at fruit. I mean, this was developed over time as we were becoming proficient at hunting. I mean, we developed bipedalism, we developed sweating. All these things had a role in our capacity to hunt. Not only that, from our primate lineage, if we're going to go with the evolutionary model, we've had tremendous adaptation to our guts to allow more meat eating and less plant eating, particularly in the hind gut, where we shrunk our colon and cecum significantly and lengthened our small intestine, which is designed to absorb meat and fat. Now we have dedicated gut transporters specifically designed to absorb meat-related compounds. Carnosine, carnitine are several. Hydroxylysine, hydroxyproline. These are meat-based products which we have specific transporters to absorb in our gut, not to mention the fact that we secrete, lipases and proteases, trypsins, chymotrypsins, so on and so forth, a gallbladder to help us digest fat. So to say we have no anatomic, genetic, or physiologic adaptations to meat eating is, in my view, just completely ridiculous. She talks about trichromatic vision, and the reason we can see in, trichromatic vision, so we can distinguish colors, is so we could acquire fruit. And while we do have that, that's true, and many carnivores have dichromatic vision, we evolved from primates, and primates developed this, tens of millions of years ago, and there was no reason for us to lose that adaptation just because we took on a carnivorous type. There was no advantage to losing that. So it's not like we, as humans, developed trichromatic division after we evolved. We already had it when we were primates, and we just retained that capacity. Same with amylase and some capacity to digest plants. They talk about vitamin C, and we're being completely reliant on plants. As a carnivore that hasn't eaten vitamin C in 3 years, I strongly dismiss that statement. In fact, we know that fresh meat has vitamin C, and we've known that vitamin C we can cure scurvy, prevent scurvy with just fresh meat. So that's also a wrong statement. We get Dr. Mark Thomas on there saying, and he's another anthropology guy, saying that the brain can only use glucose. I mean, this is a ridiculous statement. We know that brains can run on ketones as well. In many cases, it requires less oxidative stress to use ketones rather than glucose in the brain. And so just on face, it's just a ridiculous argument. They then make the teeth argument, which is basically a face palm to me. I mean, they're talking about how carnivores have serrated teeth and humans have flat teeth. Well, we have cusps on our teeth. I mean, to say that we're not anatomically adapted by our jaw and teeth to eat meat is ridiculous. I mean, all you got to do is go get some ribs. Your teeth work just fine for eating meat. Humans have been eating meat for 3 million years. To say that our teeth don't allow us to eat meat is absolutely ridiculous when people eat meat every single day of their existence. Of course we can eat meat. Our teeth are not flat. We have cusps, bicuspids, molars. These all have cusps on them. These aren't flat grinding teeth like they talk about. So, I mean, the teeth argument is just ridiculous. And then finally, he talks about B12. Everybody was eating dirt back in the day, and that's why people were drinking water from dirty streams. And then another sort of silly argument, but this is one the vegans like to use. We then cut back to the trail. Scott Jurek gets injured on the run. Maybe no surprise, he's a vegan. We got, then cut back to Arnold Schwarzenegger, starts talking more about the meat industry, how the meat industry made human beings eat meat. It's all marketing, and I'm sure that the reason cavemen eat meat was because the meat eating industry was marketing to it. I'm sure 10,000 years ago people were eating meat because the meat industry was marketing to them. So it's ridiculous. People have been eating meat forever. It's not because the meat industry told us to eat meat. It's because meat is what humans eat. So silly argument. We see we get this guy, Dr. Aaron Spitz, who actually lives in my town. Hell, he may be one of my neighbors. I don't know. But he, is this vegan guy that wrote the penis book, and he's doing this penis experiment on 3 guys, 3 collegiate athletes, and he feeds them a meal. I think it was a burrito with. They love to use burritos for this study for some reason. A burrito, so it's not just a plain steak. It's a bunch of plant compounds mixed with a little bit of meat. So burrito meal one night, and then a bean burrito meal the next night, I think, or some sort of meat substitute meal the next night. And he looks at erection quality, erection frequency overnight on these 3 guys. And, I don't know how many times they did this experiment. Maybe they did it once, maybe they did it multiple times to get the result they wanted. But they show that on day 1, when the meat, they had less erections. On day 2, they had more erections. Now, this is completely non-scientific. Spitz says so himself. It's not a scientific study. A lot of confounding factors. What happened on the first day that didn't happen on the second day, besides maybe this burrito difference. I mean, there's a lot of things that confound that. Maybe the first night people don't do as well. They're not used to they don't sleep as well because they've got this contraption on the leg. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that could have occurred. It's completely a non-scientific study. It's done for shock value. I will tell you, as someone on a carnivore diet and many other people that have been on this diet as well, meat does not impede your ability to have erections. It is completely false. It's ridiculous. Red meat, in my view, go back to Kellogg's back in the 1890s. They were cutting out red meat of the diet because they were worried about people having too much lustful thoughts, having sex, masturbating, because they were getting erections and their genitalia was working fine. So this is just a silly little, gag that they use to try to play on insecurities of men, which is just ridiculous. We then get to see Nimai Delgado make an appearance where he goes up and flexes his muscles and says, well, look at my plant muscles. Again, another example of a guy, and he says he's never eaten meat in his whole life, vegetarian from birth, milk, eggs, whey protein, dairy, builds his muscle up, goes vegan, does one bodybuilding show, really hasn't done much since then. Not even a true bodybuilder, he's more of a physique competitor. He's only about 170 pounds, not a big guy at all. Again, built some muscle up on animal products, maintains it okay on a vegan product, takes ridiculous amounts of supplements most likely. I'm not going to speculate as to whether the guy's using steroids or not. Probably not, because he's not that big of a guy. We then go see more epidemiology. They look at an Oxford study. Again, it's just same old thing. Epidemiology showing some point. They go on to talk about testosterone in this next study, and the funny thing about this study, they say, well, the vegans had a little bit slightly higher testosterone. When you look at the study, when you actually read this study, they show that they had slightly higher testosterone, but they had lower free testosterone, which is the actual, part of the testosterone that you need. And they actually had higher estradiol. So they had more estrogen, less free testosterone, and they want to point out the study saying they had more, total testosterone, which again is sort of silly in my view. We go on to Mishka Janiak, another bodybuilder. Again, another guy who built up all his muscle as an omnivore, switched to veganism, is able to maintain muscle. I mean, and taking gobs of protein supplements, I'm sure. Okay, then we get to the towards the end of the film, we get back to the Tennessee Titans, and we get Charity and Derek Morgan and the Titans come over for dinner, and she's talking about plant-based and how they go and go on and eat a plant-based diet. And so it's very interesting when you look at the guys that were part of that program, the featured guys. And so we see these people walk in, and we've got Jarrell Casey comes in there, and now when you look at him, he's not a vegan anymore. I don't know if he ever was. He's eating fish, so he's still eating animal products. And then I don't know how plant-based he was, but he got injured, had a long time to improve his knee. We see Brian Arakpo. Again, what happened to Brian Arakpo? Got injured, retired from the NFL. We get Ty Smith, another guy, vegan, in this vegan dinner thing. What happened to him? Spent the entire 2018 season on the injured reserve list. 2019, he's played enough to have 1 tackle so far. So I don't know how vegan or plant-based he is, but he has not done well. Wesley Woodyard, now for the first time in his life, again, I don't know how vegan he is, but he is now not starting for the first time since 2011. And then we have Richard Matthews, another guy who got injured and left the NFL. So almost everyone, I think 1 athlete out of that. And then Derek Morgan himself, again, went plant-based, had a little bit better improvement as he cut the junk food out, multiple injuries, retired from the NFL. Almost every one of those guys that they show in that video in the period of, 1 to 2 years from the shooting of that video, depending on when it was shot, is now retired or injured or doesn't play well or is not playing well. Same thing with, the guy Griff from the earlier study. All the vegans, vegetarians in the film, injured, career ending. We get back to the film. We're seeing more evidence of James Wilkes' dad having a heart attack. They talk about where he grew up in a village. They were promoting meat pies and meat was everywhere and so on and so forth, saying how the media manipulated people into eating meat. No, people eat meat on their own without manipulation. I mean, the people in Africa who still hunt animals are not being manipulated by the media to hunt and kill animals. They eat that because they know it's something they need. They try to use language that the meat industry is the same as a cigarette industry. They're trying to confuse you. They're trying to downplay the negative effects, and this is just, a straw man argument. I mean, look, we're looking at relative risk numbers for meat tremendously small, so small. If we look at the World Health Organization study on cancer, 17% relative risk increase. We look at that compared to smoking, where we see 2,000, 3,000% increase in relative risk. It's not even in the same ballpark. Epidemiology at these tiny, tiny levels is basically worthless, and that's what everyone's saying. We then go and they briefly talk to David Katz, who's like one of the biggest shills in the world. He's taken millions of dollars from food industry, talking about how plant-based diets are clearly superior. I mean, again, it's just, you can't trust anything coming out of that guy's mouth. We then switch over to Africa, where they talk about this guy, this former special forces guy out there trying to fight poaching to save the rhinos. And while that's certainly admirable, and I certainly applaud him for doing that, he then comes to the conclusion that, well, the only way to really save the rhinos and the animals of the world is to not eat meat at all. That's his conclusion there. Now, this is complete garbage, because if we were to say we're not going to eat cows and we take away from domestication of animals and agriculture, people would eat the hell out of the rhinos. I mean, this is what would happen, because people are not going to give up meat. So the fact that we have cows keeps us from eating all these other wild animals. I mean, this is what clearly is happening. So, I mean, this argument is just ridiculous to assume that 8 billion people on the planet are going to give up eating meat because you said so, or, you think you're going to protect the environment or whatever, is just completely garbage. And so this whole argument is just ridiculous. They then go on to use some environmental stats, which again are completely misleading, which is what vegans love to do. They talk about 80+% of land usage being used for animal agriculture, and that's 80% of agricultural land. So not all land, but agricultural land. Land that's been identified as suitable for agriculture. And we have to remember that almost all of that 80% that they utilize is in land where you cannot grow crops. This is marginal land. This is range land. You cannot grow crops there. So what else are you going to do with it? You put animals on there that can feed us. I mean, this is just a stupid argument to talk about land usage, This is why we have factory farming. In fact, one of the reasons is people complaining about environmental impacts. And so what they did was they consolidated that into feedlots and used less land. In fact, we use much less land in the United States than we used to. for these environmental causes. We use less water, we use less food, we create less methane due to this. But this is all based on misguided environmental concerns. Water usage, they talk about, all the water the cows use, the, 2,000 plus the liters. Again, we have to realize that the water used by grazing animals, particularly cattle, is almost entirely green water that comes from rainfall. And it's what they get when they eat the grass. It is water that would have fallen to the ground anyway. It's not taking away from water usage in the land. In fact, in the U.S., cows are only responsible for about 5% of our water usage. It's a small amount to produce food that we have to eat. And we have to remember, worldwide about 95 to 98% of the water cows are given is rainwater, green water. It's a little bit more in the United States because of the feedlot system, but it's still a small percentage. And the majority of that water is recycled by the cow. The cows breathe out moisture, they urinate, they defecate. All that moisture goes back into the water table, into the water cycle. So it's totally misleading to talk about that. They then quote the 15% number about greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually 14.5, but they round up to 15. And this is, again, I'm sure to the dismay of the Cowspiracy folks who quoted it as 51% back when Cowspiracy came out several years ago, which is clearly wrong based on World Resource Institute, bogus numbers. But the 15% they quote is a life cycle assessment, and they compare it to transportation, which is not a life cycle assessment. So what they're doing is they're comparing every single scrap of, carbon dioxide that goes into producing cows from transportation, processing, raising, feeding crops, belches, manure, packaging, transport to the grocery store. All of that is included in the cow's assessment. Whereas in the transportation assessment, all they do is look at what comes out the back end, the tailpipe of the car or the jet engine, when they totally disregard everything that goes into the transportation sector, which includes harvesting material to build the planes, build the cars, build the runways, maintain the runways, all of this stuff in transportation, which if they did a life cycle assessment, it would blow cows away. Now, the other thing about that 15% number is it's a worldwide number. The majority of those greenhouse gases are coming from third world countries like India, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, where they are very inefficient about how they manage cattle. We also know that methane from cattle is not increasing in the atmosphere. It's been done on isotopic data. NASA and some other organizations have checked this. The methane in the atmosphere that has increased in the last several decades is not coming from cows. We also know that methane is completely recycled within about 10 years, as opposed to carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, which spend thousands of years in the atmosphere. And it also, if we look at Western countries like the U.S., the carbon footprint of cows is about 2% of our greenhouse gases, whereas transportation is 28%, industry is about the same, and energy is about the same. So the vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions from cows in developed countries are not coming from cattle. So anyway, this is another misleading number. And again, in the United States, 4% of our greenhouse gases are total animal agriculture. 5% are coming from plants. So plant agriculture produces more greenhouse gases in the United States than cattle do. And that number does include the plants that cows eat. We go back to the fire department. Ripleyson shows people lower their cholesterol by 21 points and lose 6 pounds. Some of them had lower blood pressure. Exciting stuff. You can do that on an animal-based diet too. Probably much better, in fact. Then Arnold comes back and he gets a little feisty, and the only cuss word in the film is from Arnold, and he goes, "Who the fuck are you to tell me how to eat?" And I agree with Arnold. Who the fuck are you people to tell us how to eat, to try to pressure us to eat a certain way? We'll make our own decisions on what's good for our health. Scott Jurek at the end makes it to the film, to the top of the peak. Again, as I pointed out, his record got slaughtered by 5 days shortly after. It's been broken several times since then. And the recent record is held by a guy who eats bacon and eggs. I guess Scott Jurek was also fined for littering at the top or something like that, which I thought was interesting. And then we go to the end of the finale of the film, more or less, and we've got Patrick Baboumian sets a fake world record. You know, he goes in there and he does a yoke walk with 1,200 pounds in front of a bunch of people at some vegetarian festival. It's portrayed as some world record, the most weight that any man has ever lifted.
Someone's at the entryway.
But what actually we don't know, and they don't tell you in the film, is in 2015 at the Arnold Strongman class, the guys were carrying 1,500 pounds, 300 pounds more than Baboumian was using. So I mean, it's nowhere near a world record. It's not even close. He wouldn't even make the qualifying round at the Arnold, or the World's Strongest Man. It's just more just people for the people that are uneducated. So in total, obviously propaganda, obviously cherry-picked misleading data, heavy reliance on epidemiology, mostly either guys that built muscle on meat, then switched briefly to plant-based. The ones that stayed vegan saw their career plummet. The ones that were vegetarian, still eating animal products, seemed to do okay. So let me know what you guys think. This is a game changer. You don't have to watch it now. Please don't watch it. You will not be any smarter for it. I think I lost some brain cells for watching this. No, I will not be going vegan as a result of this. No, I don't think Joe Rogan will be going vegan as a result of this film. Again, it's just more propaganda. And the nice thing is, I think we are in a point where more and more people are intelligent enough to dismiss this stuff for the complete and utter propaganda garbage that it is. All right, guys, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the review.